Hi, and welcome to the Existential Coach. I just watched an interview with the Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, and he was talking about what was going on and what is going on currently in Ukraine. And towards the end of this interview, you're watching a man who has seen the emptiness that happens in a war where whatever the cause, whatever the reason, whatever the motivation, is erased as you stare at death, as you stare at destruction. And after I went for a walk and I thought of asking a group of people, saying, and I'm going to do this here now, and I'm going to do this with you, is asking a question and encouraging you to not try and answer it, to not try and think of an answer. So the question is, when is war all right? When is war okay? I think the challenge that happens as we contemplate war is we immediately fill in some reason. We say there's a religious reason, there's a political reason, there's an economic reason. And individuals argue about those reasons, those constructs, those concepts. And of course there's differing opinions, differing views about what the reasons are, what the concepts are, what the validity of the concepts are, and then people debate these things. And I would say that those things aren't really about war. Those are about concepts. So in asking you, when is war okay? And pointing out that it's virtually impossible for us to not think of some reason to come up with that, in a sense, saves us from what we're on some level sensing, which is war is the abyss. It is the end of all reasons. It is a black hole. Drawn within it is all of the reasons that people have. And in thinking about what Romeo Dallaire saw in his experience in Rwanda, and thinking about the experiences that are going on in Ukraine and other places, there very well may be discussions about these conflicts, past and present, and there are robust conversations and debates about the ins and outs of things. For example, should there or should there not be a no-fly zone? Yet, the war is happening, the destruction is happening. And of course the argument is, well, we're trying to mitigate, more destruction or what could happen. But again, we haven't really answered the question, have we? We've tried to block or avoid the underlying experience of chaos. That is, war is the absence of reason. It is the absence of empathy. It is the absence of love. It is the absence of acknowledgement. It is the absence of virtually everything. And ultimately, war is the absence of concepts. It is only destruction. So what does this mean from an existential perspective? Well, one of the drives that occur in our lives is the death drive. And we tend to think of the death drive as being our physical death. That is to say, that we will one day die. It is one of the things that we all share. And as true as that is, there is another dimension to the death drive. And in effect, like our physical death is a finishing, the death drive moves us towards some kind of conclusion, some kind of finishing. Now, as we push towards these kinds of conclusions, these finishings, I'll call them, this doesn't necessarily mean they're a good finishing, doesn't mean that they're a good conclusion. It means that we can't withstand the chaos, the uncertainty. And so we retreat into our concepts. And so we get into a conceptual death. That is, we're fighting for a cause of some kind. And this can be, of course, aligned in a variety of different ways. However, what's happening is essentially a physical solution to a conceptual problem. And by that I mean arguing over the ideological or the conceptual notions of, for example, borders. And saying that that is the reason to destroy, to annihilate. And coming up with additional reasons, secondary reasons, right? You know, you're doing it for resources, you're doing it for getting control over areas, mitigating, and so on and so forth. But those are all secondary reasons for what is a reaction to this feeling of death, this feeling of, I need to control it, I need to know it, I need to, in some way, connect with my own finishing. And this notion of, for example, you know, we could be on the precipice of a nuclear war, nuclear winter, that, for example, a no-fly zone would create some scenario whereby the West would be drawn into World War III, and this would be the last war. All of these things still don't answer the fundamental question. Or do you think they do? Do you think they answer the question? Do you think life is about holding on no matter what? That life is about saying, okay, well, we're not going to do these things, or we're not going to engage these things in this way, whether it's a no-fly zone or whatever it is, because that's going to make things worse. And so what we're going to do is we're going to handle these things in a measured way. But what I come up against time and time again, and this has come up in different episodes, obviously in a different context, but, you know, if we step into the way I've talked about in the past, it's always been, you know, focused on conversations with individuals about their boundaries, which you could really call their borders. And one of the things I've discussed is we have this conceptual notion of a border, that it is, you know, within it we are, on the outside we are not, right? And so we then make whatever rules about how we do or do not interact. And my dad had a really good way of term for this. He called it a horizon point. And I think it speaks to the kind of fluidity that goes on between this inner and outer world that don't actually exist. And borders don't actually exist, right? And I don't mean this in the naive way that I think it's sometimes used, that we're all the human race and that's all there is to it, because I think that sometimes tries to escape the complexity, which is to say, and here I use the word complexity the same way I would use the word holism, right? It's about this allness, if you will, this idea that there are these infinite connections that are occurring, and we don't have control over them. They're constantly changing. They're endlessly dynamic. And that in that process, things emerge that we're good with, we're bad with, we're confused by, and so on. And that process is the evolution of our, you know, kind of collected experience. This has been referred to as a rhizome, which is to say, it's a kind of complex set of roots that are growing in all these directions. And I think that's a more helpful way of thinking about how we can address the question I asked at the beginning of this podcast, which is, when is war okay? And if, as I've discussed in previous podcasts, like the podcast on boundaries, if boundaries are this kind of conception, and if, as my dad said, there's a horizon point that exists between whatever we call inner and whatever we call outer, then it's not fixed. Whatever construct we think is fixed, it's not fixed. Now, of course, an argument can be made that the nuclear holocaust would be the end of all, and that all should be done to try and stop that from happening. And I am in no way disputing that. The question I'm raising is, if that is the ultimate thing we are avoiding, then why are we constantly being pulled towards it? This is what, you know, my life, I was born in 1972, and I didn't experience the Cold War in the same way that people in earlier generations did. But nonetheless, I was very aware of of this tension between Russia and America, or Russia and the West more generally. And I can't help but wonder, why have we had this consistent tension about a nuclear holocaust for so long? What's inside that experience? Is it a kind of questioning about existence itself? What does it mean? What would happen if everything just ended? Did we matter? So on an individual level, we often think, is my life mattering? Do I have a job that matters? Am I in a relationship that matters? Am I doing things that are meaningful to me? Maybe I'm working in a place, but I want to find more meaning in that job, or I want to switch jobs. Maybe I'm in a relationship and it's fine, but I want to find a more meaningful relationship. Maybe I want to trust an aspect of myself that I haven't really explored, I haven't really allowed to exist for whatever reason. I've been busy, or life didn't go that way, and a part of me would really like to get in touch with that. Or maybe I'm in a position where I feel like my life is very good and I feel very fulfilled. But all of these questions are swimming around in an ocean of meaning. And I can't help but wonder that within that, whether we're struggling for meaning or we feel very fulfilled, we are still compelled towards this sense of ending, that nuclear holocaust, that's the reason to not engage. And I'm not saying it's a bad reason. In fact, I think it's a great reason. I think it's a very good reason to not. To be clear, I think a nuclear holocaust is a very bad thing. But what I'm trying to understand, and what's been such a struggle, is why we're drawn towards the single thing we fear the most. We've been drawn towards this nuclear question since the first bomb was dropped. And we've flirted with it as a society, as a global society, ever since the first bomb was dropped. Why? I don't know. I don't understand why the thing that could destroy everything is the thing we continue to taunt. And I think there's another component to this that is also about the environmental catastrophe, right? That increasingly people are being affected. So why again are we drawn towards this form of destruction? Why chance it? If I said to you, say you have a house or an apartment or wherever you're living, and I said, there's a good chance your house is going to burn down, or your building is going to burn down. How do you live your life? What do things mean? What are the questions you're asking yourself? So, are we able to take something seriously that really challenges how we understand our own existence? And are we, in this way, stepping into the concepts, which are often completely irrational, because they're not meant to be rational? They're meant to move us away from, at least in our minds, this inevitable sense that it could all end. That we are denying that the very thing we are constantly flirting with is the destruction we say we don't want. And so I find myself increasingly confused by all of these structures that are power-based through and through, and yet at every turn, we're consistently surprised that there's exploitation, that there's destruction of life. We are flabbergasted that these things are happening, yet they're happening every minute of every day, of every month, of every year. So at a certain point, when do we stop and say what this means to us? Why we're doing it? When do we stop and say why we are, if not wholly complicit, certainly a passive, benign force that is not an inhibitor to what this question of destruction is? And remember, this question of destruction is important because people are saying, well, we can't actually engage because it could lead to destruction, which says it is important. But is it? Is it important if we haven't answered the fundamental question? Do we actually know why we go to war? If the outcome of a nuclear holocaust is the end of humanity, what possible why can be answered? What possible triumph can be had unless it exists in conceptualism, in idealism, in ideology? There's simply no way for a nuclear holocaust to be the best of two outcomes. Yet, to not have a no-fly zone, to not engage, is that to stop the question of nuclear holocaust? No, of course not. I mean, that's been a question going on for decades. So we're not talking about stopping it. We're just talking about skirting it this time, but while still not addressing the fundamental problem, which, as I said at the very, very beginning of this podcast, why do we go to war? And so as we peel back the layers, and I think we're getting a bit of a sense of that in this podcast, as we peel back the layers, we find that there's all these concepts that exist in terms of our identity, whether it's I'm a Canadian or I'm a Westerner, and that has a certain connotation to it. It can be I was born in a certain year, I live in a certain time, and that has a certain connotation to it. All of these things are concepts that structure my life in a certain way that then aligns me with some side. Yet, what is that side? Now, of course, somebody could say, well, that's very naive. How can you just talk in terms of this global citizen notion? I mean, there's no real model for global citizenry. Even ones that have been attempted, like the EU, there's all sorts of issues with it. There's certainly a lot of political upheavals, Brexit, of course, being one of those things. And I think that speaks to a conceptual weakness that we are trying to use again and again to solve something that really is so profound, which is we are looking to finish the whatever it is through this kind of act of death and flirting with death to feel like we've made it, that we're alive, which really, again, comes down to, well, why are we going to war? Is it really to feel like we are alive, to feel like we have agency? Do we invade countries to feel powerful? Do we conquer people to feel powerful? Do we extort and exploit to feel powerful? If the entire ideology and the epistemological frame is that of power, then the outcome will be a holocaust, a nuclear holocaust. It's just a matter of time. Now, you can say, well, that seems like too far. Well, let's just say it is too far. Let's just say what I'm talking about right now is more of a thought experiment. But I can't help but think the way Romeo Dallaire was at the end of that interview. He was no longer a man in an interview answering a couple questions. He was a man who was seeing things in his mind, and we were seeing him see those things. And there was a feeling that this man had seen madness. He'd seen it up close, where all of the reasons were gone, and all that mattered was one thing: inaction. That's it. At a certain point, it's just people dying. However many reasons you have, however many good intentions you have, at a certain point, it's just death. And this is the most striking of things, because if our lives actually don't mean anything, if what we create as artists, or what we create as, we have families, or we work for a company, or our hobbies and our connections within the community, all of that stuff doesn't matter, because all of it can just be chopped away, then how do we exist? And this is why it becomes such a fundamental existential question. The meaning that we have is not simply the meaning of the things we do, right? I mean, that's a part of it. But the meaning we have is, how do we actually exist? How do we actually know we are safe? How do we actually know we are connected? How do we actually know there's a direction, a context, anything? How do we know we exist? Yet, how can we know that if it seems so easy to destroy it all? And I think the environmental component of this is related because there seems to be some kind of disconnect between how we understand ourselves in the world and what we are doing in the world. And it seems to be coming back to create a precarious situation for us, which can only harm us. Why would we do that? Why would we consistently do things that could lead to, in the case of a nuclear holocaust, the end of humanity? Why? Is there a pathology going on? Is there an inability to challenge our concepts, challenge the way we see things? So take, for example, environmental concerns. Are we unable to conceptually see different ways of existing in the world? So as a result, we have to carry on the ways in which we are existing in the world. And those ways will lead to death. Similarly, in war, are we holding on to ways in which we see borders, ways in which we see citizens, ways in which we see countries? And those ways will lead to war, and those wars, depending on who you're fighting, will lead to nuclear war. This is actually pretty simple and actually pretty causal. Yet, why are we surprised? Well, I think we're surprised because we kind of think, yeah, but it won't really happen. Which says to me, we haven't really understood what Romeo Dallaire understands. And I certainly have not seen anything like that. I mean, of course, I've seen video and I've seen things broadcast, but I've never experienced anything like what he experienced. And I can only imagine, and in that imagining, I am haunted. And in seeing him, evoked within him, those images, I am haunted. So I can't imagine what that's like, to feel helpless on the most fundamental human level, to help people there are no concepts. There's no telling somebody, oh, well, it's because of this economic policy why you're being killed, or it's because of this political jargon because you're being killed, or it's because of this religious belief, that's why you're being killed. None of that stuff means anything. Not when you get into war. And, there's another aspect of this, too, that I'm kind of sensitive to, because I was among the first generation of my family who didn't need to join the military. Prior to me, many of my family members, just for economic reasons, joined the military. And so family members fought in World War I and World War II and the Korea War. And that has a real effect on families in ways that it's impossible to understand. It's a silent war that never ends, right? That permeates the family. And so as we're talking about what's going on in Ukraine or Yemen and other parts of the world, past and present, and as we're thinking about war, and we go back to that first question, I want to ask again, when is war okay? I can't come up with an answer. You can say, well, war is okay if somebody's invaded and you go and help them. You can say, well, war is okay if you have to protect your own interests. But I'm struggling to see how war is okay when it's not attached to any value of life. Because what we're talking about preserving is not life. We're talking about preserving political relationships, economic relationships, and religious relationships. We're talking about preserving the concepts of life. And the fundamental value of existence, of parents and their children living safely in a community, that's not a political or a religious or an economic question. That's life. Yet, for some reason, approaching that is a bridge too far. So, just to kind of turn back a bit and do a little bit of a review, certainly this podcast is maybe different in tone than some of the others. And what I hope to do here is not answer anything. I never want to answer anything. That's not my role, and it's not what I'm interested in. But I am interested in provoking my own thoughts, and then I share them here as I record them and talk to you and and perhaps something jumps out at you and you spin off in your direction, kind of like that idea of the rhizome, the root structure that's going out in all these directions. Because I do believe, and it's one of the few things I think I can say I believe, that by developing a tolerance for complexity, we move towards a humanity that does not lock us into these simplistic concepts that do walk us down the line of destruction. And that ultimately these ends, whether it's the symbolic death or the real death, are because there was a system in place, a set of tracks that were laid, and we couldn't get off them. And what I'm saying is, let's get off the tracks. Let's question ourselves, what we think war is, why we think that, what do we actually know about it, what purpose does our opinion have about a war, and how does that actually connect with the people who are experiencing war, who are the victims of war. I think what we find is, and certainly what I find is, the way in which our concepts can be a kind of conspiracy against humanity, allowing us to create this safe zone where we can watch destruction take place, but not engage it in a meaningful way. That is, not recognize that inhumanity is, and the loss of reason and the absence of reason is what war is. It is the abyss. So, in thinking about that, I'm wondering, myself, what do I do? I mean, yes, I can do this podcast, and yes, I can talk to people about what this experience is, but what do I do? And I don't know. And I think saying I don't know has some kind of value to me that at least keeps me open to try and think a little bit more beyond what the structure is right now. Because one thing I'm pretty confident in is that the structure that we have right now, its trajectory is pretty obvious. We may get lucky, things may, 11th hour, things happen. But is luck a plan? Is luck a value? It's easy to come down on what, a political party or a country should or shouldn't do. And I think it's sometimes helpful to remember that we live on one planet, and there's a spectrum from total famine and warlord conditions to socialized countries where people have guaranteed income, access to education and healthcare. And we're struggling to find something in all of that. So if we can remember that the spectrum is really broad, and so maybe simplistic answers or naive political answers or economic answers or religious answers aren't going to do it. If we can be a little bit more with the unknown and start to explore the way in which our values align, and by that I simply mean how we experience ourselves in a non-conceptual way, then perhaps we can start to think more broadly and shake away these ways of doing things that really have locked us on to a kind of tracks towards the nuclear holocaust, towards the environmental catastrophe that is pending. Because if we are not going to be awake, then we will simply follow what we followed for years. So I wanted to do this podcast for one reason, and I'm saying this at the end because I hope, regardless of what I said, I hope this invites people to talk more about this in a non-partisan way and talk about what they're feeling, what they're thinking, the contradictions, the mess, all of it. Because war is the absence of reason. And so if we can bring ourselves to be present and to start to really awaken within ourselves reason, then we can begin to combat the habits that have brought us to a place of war. And this was something that was talked about in a book. I forget the author, but the book's called The Guns of August. It was written by a Canadian. And it talks about the tracks that brought countries to World War I. And this is something that has been repeated time and time again. So if we can look at these things and explore these things and realize the purpose is to break off from the tracks that have brought us here, not to repeat them. So thanks for listening, and as always, if you're interested, you can reach out. You can find me at jordano'connor.com. All right, bye for now.